Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing the Sharks 2022 restricted free agents situation. It was just today at 5 p.m. Eastern Time where the Sharks, as well as every other NHL team, had to submit their lists of their restricted free agents who they were extending qualifying offers to, and which ones they have decided to allow become unrestricted free agents once free agency does open on Wednesday in just a couple of days. And usually for the San Jose Sharks, there aren't too many surprises, which is why I don't always make a video of this every single year, because most of the time these people who you expect to get qualifying offers do end up getting them, and then the players who end up becoming unrestricted free agents are kind of fringe AHL type of players who you would never really see in a San Jose Sharks jersey in multiple years, so they're not really a huge loss to the team. But in this season in particular, it seems as though Mike Grier continues to take this hardline stance on the San Jose Sharks and try to really shake up the roster, as there were not one but multiple different unexpected surprises here for the San Jose Sharks, and a couple of them that I don't really agree with. Now let's start off with which restricted free agents got a qualifying offer and weren't actually a surprise. The first one was, of course, Ferraro. This was probably the most obvious qualifying offer. He's clearly far and away the best player on the list of qualifying offer, or on the restricted free agents list, let's just say, for the San Jose Sharks. It also makes complete sense that both Cunnin and Kakinen would get qualifying offers. Both of these players were acquired relatively recently for the San Jose Sharks. Cunnin was just within the past week or so by Mike Grier himself, so obviously he gets a qualifying offer. Kakinen was acquired in a trade for Jacob Middleton, and he was the big piece of that trade from Minnesota, so it obviously makes sense to extend a qualifying offer to him. And then the other couple of players were Shemalevsky and Gregor, who I thought had pretty solid seasons this past year, especially at the end of the season. Gregor found a lot of good chemistry with Bordelot. Shemalevsky was probably one of the more underrated players there for the San Jose Sharks at the end of the season, so I was happy to see both of these two players extended. The last player who was given a qualifying offer I will get to a bit later. In terms of the players sent to unrestricted free agency, there also were multiple of these fringe AHL players who I mentioned earlier, players like Gallant, McGrew, Morand, Pasichnuk. These are players. Pasichnuk did get one game at the NHL level, if I'm not mistaken, but the others I don't think really got anywhere. They're not really going to get anywhere over these next few years, so not a really big loss for the San Jose Sharks. The player who's probably the most notable of these would be Joachim Blickfeld, but it was quite obvious he wouldn't actually be given a qualifying offer, because we of course got the news that just a couple of weeks ago he signed with a team overseas, so it kind of was to be expected. But let's get into the first of multiple surprises here for the San Jose Sharks, and the first would be Zak Sachenko. He was allowed to become an unrestricted free agent. For those who may have watched all of the San Jose Sharks this past season, you should be familiar with who Zak Sachenko was. Prior to the arrival of Kakinen, he was the backup goaltender for both Hill and James Reimer, and so since Hill was injured for much of this past season, and Reimer didn't necessarily stay entirely healthy the entire time, Sachenko not only saw some games in relief of Reimer, but actually got a couple of starts as well, and I thought he looked pretty decent through most of his time in the NHL. Yes, his stats don't look fantastic, but it should also be noted that because of the small sample size, certain games might stand out and really drag down his stats. In particular, his game against the Stanley Cup champion Colorado Avalanche doesn't look particularly favorable in terms of stats, but that's not necessarily that much of a surprise considering how good the Avalanche, of course, were this past season. But he otherwise, I thought, looked pretty decent. But I will say this is probably the least surprising of these surprises, just because the Sharks' goaltending pipeline is a bit crowded. Reimer, Kakinen, and Hill are three potential sort of starter/backup goaltenders that the San Jose Sharks have, so they already have to make a decision there. And while Reimer is rather old and likely won't be part of the San Jose Sharks at the end of this next season, or if he's even traded away at some point, he may not even be a part of the Sharks this upcoming season, but both Hill and Kakinen are rather young, so it makes sense that you don't want that that much clog there up at the top. And when it comes to sort of the future of the San Jose Sharks in 2-3 years time, they do have Magnus Krona, they have Benjamin Goodrow, and so maybe the Sharks just didn't see a lot of room for Zak Sachenko to really grow, but it is still somewhat disappointing because he had a couple of decent looks at the NHL level. The next player who I do want to talk about is kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum. While he is still a surprise, he is, in my opinion, a surprise in a good way, and that would be with Nick Malosh. It seemed as though that the Sharks' previous head coaching staff and managerial staff were very much in love with what Malosh brought to the game, which for me, in my perspective, was very little, and seemingly from Mike Greer's perspective is also very little, and yet he managed to get an actual pretty consistent lineup spot for the San Jose Sharks. He got like over 15 minutes per game, which for a player of his caliber who should be like a seventh defenseman at best is actually a pretty decent amount of minutes, and it felt as though he was getting in the way, in particular of a player like Ryan Merkley this past season, of getting more minutes, and going into next season when Knyzhov will hopefully be fully healthy, he would also get in the way of that. So it makes sense in my eyes for why Malosh was not extended, but of course it does still come as a surprise because he kind of seemed like a decent sort of piece for the San Jose Sharks in their top six this past season. But it's interesting, and I guess in a way kind of nice to see them move on from him. However, of course, the biggest surprise here does have to come down to Jonathan Dahlin. There was a report just yesterday that it was rumored that he wouldn't be given a qualifying offer. I was taken aback by that news, extremely surprised. I was beginning to even doubt that that could possibly be the case. But here, of course, today, with the news, the Sharks have officially announced that this is indeed the case. And it just kind of really baffles me for why this move was actually made. Because, of course, many of these players who were allowed to go to unrestricted free agency, they weren't going to move the needle at all for the San Jose Sharks over these next few years, but Jonathan Dahlin certainly had the potential to do so. I mean, we saw over the stretch of this past season where he played about 3/4 of the year. Yes, he didn't finish the season particularly well, but he had a lot of sort of COVID protocol issues. There were a couple of injuries, but it should be sort of hung on to the fact that he had a very solid start to the season, was on the first line with Couture and Meyer, and for a long while that was the Sharks' best and potentially even only good line for the first month or so of the season. In fact, it was even one of the better lines in the entire league to start. And yes, it fell off at a point. Dahlin ended up being sort of a bottom six forward, kind of at the fault of Bob Booner, but also kind of not at the fault of Bob Booner. Also some of the fault of Dahlin, who just necessarily wasn't playing all that well, but still, yes, he didn't have a very good end of the season. Yes, he ended up being healthy scratch, but he certainly had the potential to be a decent player for the San Jose Sharks and probably earned himself another look, especially when you consider the fact that his contract was extremely favorable. I mean, the fact remains is that he was at a league minimum deal this past season, and in terms of qualifying offer, he would only have a very, very slight raise, which is extremely minimal. It kind of reminds me of the Ryan Donato situation just last season, where the Sharks did not extend a qualifying offer to him, but the major difference is that Ryan Donato was making $1.9 million, so a qualifying offer would see him making just over $2 million, which is something that the Sharks seemingly didn't want to deal with because that is a non-negligible amount of money. But the fact that Dahlin would be making, barely, I don't even think he'd reach the $800,000 mark on a qualifying offer, kind of makes it so that it's a bit less understandable. Now, of course, he did have arbitration rights, which does throw a wrench into the plan, but I don't really see a world where he's really rewarded with that much money in terms of a contract because of the rough end of the season he had. I would have been very surprised if through arbitration he got anything more than like $1.5 million at most on a single year deal, because I really don't think there was anything sort of like amazing to say that, oh, well, he should get $2.5 million because of the 1 month of the season compared to the other 5. And so generally, I thought that this was something that would work out perfectly fine financially unless the Sharks have some sort of major big plans down the stretch here. But the fact here is that the Sharks do not really seemingly have the luxury of just passing on players who could potentially play in the top 6. Like I said, it is technically possible that the Sharks have some major master plan going into this free agency, and they're going to sign a couple of big top 6 free agency, whales at some point. Like they're going to bring in Claude Giroux, and they're going to trade for Patrick Kane from the Blackhawks or some craziness like that. It is technically possible, but realistically that's not going to happen. And honestly, I kind of hope it doesn't happen, because I don't know how much that's going to actually benefit the San Jose Sharks and if it can get them over the finish line or anything like that. And so the Sharks don't seemingly have the ability to just pass on these potential top 6 forwards, because going into next season they have Meyer and Hertl, obviously. They have Couture, I guess. Barabanov is completely borderline. Who knows if Eklund is actually going to be ready to start. And then your top six player is who? Kevin Labanc is clearly not good enough to play in that role. And then otherwise, there's pretty much no one. You can't play Bordelot there because you want to keep him at center, and so he'd probably be the third line center, and so you don't really have a better option. And you might be saying, well, there are players coming up who could be young players flexing into that top 6, but if I were a betting man and I had to bet on which of Gushin, Coe, Robbins, or Dahlin would be more fit to play in a top 6 role as soon as next season, I would have bet on Dahlin, because he is the only player in that group of 4 who has actually shown that he can play in a top 6 role over even a small stretch of games, because of course Coe, Gushin, and Robbins have not played a single NHL game between them. It is possible that they can come up and immediately be top 6 players, but it is just as unlikely, even more possible, that they're going to be AHL players next season, or maybe bottom 6 type of guys. And so it just seems like a very weird situation to just completely move on from Jonathan Dahlin when the San Jose Sharks are in zero position to just pass on actual decent offensive talent, when that was their major issue this past season. And what makes it even worse and even more baffling is the fact that they did qualify Yona Gadjevich. Now, of course, Gadjevich didn't have arbitration rights, and so his contract is pretty much locked in at being that sort of league minimum type situation compared to Dahlin, who could have gotten a semi-decent raise of, like I said, maybe $1.5 million. But Gadjevich is also nowhere near the type of player that Dahlin is, and funnily enough, Gadjevich is, if I were a betting man, not going to be better than Coe, Gushin, or Robbins, or at the very least I would want to give those 3 players more of a chance than Gadjevich, who I've already seen from this past season is not really capable of being anything more than some sort of fringe NHL fourth liner for the San Jose Sharks. He did very little for the Sharks, and the fact is that it's not as though he was not producing, but there were multiple times in multiple different games where I thought, this guy can be pretty good. There were basically zero flashes of brilliance from Yona Gadjevich that make me think that he can ever be anything more than that fourth liner. And so he's basically being signed on as some sort of 13th or 14th forward, at which point you ask the question of why Dahlin couldn't have been in a similar situation. The big thing under Doug Wilson over these past few seasons has been the idea of competition, and yet Mike Grier seems to be coming in here at this point, and it's not as though he doesn't have the right to do this, but he seems to be coming in here and trying to sort of trim the fat. And I understand trimming the fat when it comes to the bottom 6, because of course the Sharks did have a lot of players who just weren't particularly good, sort of floating around in that bottom 6 area. But when it comes to the top 6, there's not really a lot of fat to trim, and yet he's trying to do so by not giving the qualifying offer to Jonathan Dahlin, and it just doesn't really make all that much sense to me. But maybe there is some grand master plan for Mike Grier. Maybe he's sort of playing 4D chess while I'm still playing checkers, and I don't exactly see the massive landscape of moves that he has ahead of him right now. But at the moment, and haven't been a huge fan of the beginning of Mike Grier's tenure as a San Jose Sharks general manager, because I haven't really liked the Cunnin trade. I haven't really liked these moves with the restricted free agents. While the trade down at the draft was okay, the choices made weren't necessarily my favorite, so we'll see if he can bring it back. Class dismissed.